if you're watching this, likely you've made it past week 1, and this week we're going to focus on developmental risk factors for criminal behavior. It's important to know that not all criminal behaviors have their roots planted in childhood, but a great many criminal behaviors, if not most of them, do have their roots planted in childhood developmental type factors. When looking at developmental risk factors, we look at developmental pathways, a person's life course. When looking at this chapter, try to look through the lens of different combinations of these risk factors a child may have. Those would be the developmental trajectory or developmental pathways a person would have. Also remember, these developmental pathways also impact our neurological pathways, which interact with that nature versus nurture thing to possibly prevent or increase a person's likelihood of committing criminal behaviors. Also think of protective factors. The book doesn't go much into protective factors, but if you flip the risk factors over, those would basically be your protective factors, and think about different programs and things that could prevent criminal behavior from occurring in the future. Before we get into the specific risk factors, it's important to remember that just because a child or a person has some of these risk factors doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to grow up to be juvenile delinquents or criminals as they're adults. It's important to remember that correlation doesn't mean causation, but it does mean the more of them, the more significant they have some of these different risk factors, the more likely they are to engage in criminal activity. So some of the social risk factors identified in our text: poverty. People who grew up in low-income families, low-income neighborhoods, they oftentimes will have more criminal activity going on in the neighborhoods. They have more access to antisocial influences and peers. They're more likely to engage in criminal behavior. Kids who have been rejected by their peers early on in their childhoods are more at risk. Oftentimes these children have psychopathology such as ADHD, oppositional defiant disorder, conduct disorder, those types of things. Things that might make a kid more aggressive, might make a kid have difficulty in developing social skills. Those types of things make it so other kids will avoid them. Other kids might pick on them to get a reaction. And this puts kids at increased risk of developing friendships with people who might be outcasts themselves, which brings us to our next risk factor, which is having antisocial peers. When we think of antisocial peers, oftentimes we think about kids who join gangs, but it doesn't necessarily have to be as significant as that. It can be a group of kids in a neighborhood that get together and tend to push each other into more criminal types of activities, including status offenses such as smoking and drinking. Inadequate child care, kids who have good babysitters, go to good daycares, go to early childhood education such as Head Start, are less likely to develop criminal behaviors. But kids who are kind of left to fend for themselves, who go to daycare, daycares typically aren't funded all that well, and if somebody grows up in poverty and they can't afford good daycare, oftentimes they'll settle for subpar daycare where they're not getting good nutrition. They're oftentimes have other kids there that are more antisocial, so they're more likely to grow up with engaging in criminal behavior. And then also school failure, especially early school failure, kids that are held back in kindergarten, first grade, second grade. They're oftentimes labeled as being kind of an outcast right then and there, and that is a risk factor. The next set of risk factors we're going to talk about are parental and family risk factors. First off, children who grew up in single-parent households. Again, This correlation doesn't mean causation, especially this item where it's usually found with other risk factors when we do see criminal behavior. People who grow up with parents who have a permissive parenting style, such as parents who allow their children to basically run free. There are parents who oftentimes are neglectful. They kind of engage in things that they may not, the average parent would disapprove of. These kids are doing them. They're getting into things, getting in trouble, and the parent, basically just lets them do their own thing without engaging any type of discipline. Much related to that, and a risk factor, is minimal parental monitoring. Not knowing where the child is, not knowing what the child's up to, who they're hanging out with, that type of thing. Parental psychopathology, basically meaning a parent who has a significant mental illness. And the more significant the mental illness, the more significant the risk factor is. For example, a parent who has schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, borderline personality disorder, significant depressions, anxiety, those types of things, do put the child at increased risk of developing criminal behaviors, because they are oftentimes not consistently parented. Oftentimes their parents are aggressive, or they can be passive. It's just not as consistent as the parent would otherwise be had they not had the psychopathology. If the parent is in good treatment for their mental health disorder, then likely that risk factor will be minimized greatly. Children who grew up in physically or emotionally abusive households, children who witness violence or any type of trauma in the household, especially amongst family members, it really impacts them, gives them a sense of insecurity and distrust in the world, and they're more likely to engage in criminal behaviors as they get older. And then also having antisocial siblings. This could be attributed partially to social learning theory, where they see their antisocial sibling, especially if it's an older sibling, engaging in criminal acts, underage drinking, stealing, whatever. They are seeing that, and they may emulate some of those behaviors. And also there's the biological aspect. If you have antisocial siblings, and some criminal behavior can be attributed to genetics, which we'll look at in the next chapter, puts them at risk of criminal behavior. The last set of risk factors that we're going to look at are the psychological risk factors. Children who have a lack of empathy, meaning that they're not able to read other people's emotions as other people are. They don't realize when somebody may be hurting, or when somebody's happy, sad, whatever. They're just not able to pick up on some of the social cues that oftentimes we take for granted. Kids who grow up with cognitive and learning deficiencies are at risk, especially boys. People who, and this can go back to very early ages, 1-2 years old, and because that puts them at risk of school failure, that type of thing, and having a harder time making friends, etc. People who have lower intelligence, lower IQ, that's a very complex issue, and I refer you to your book for more information on that for sure. But there is a correlation between people who have low IQ and criminal behavior. For example, 4% of the prison population could be considered mentally disabled. Conduct disorder is a significant mental illness that is diagnosed in children typically, and these are kids who may be pyromaniacs, kleptomaniacs. They oftentimes may be aggressive, violent, and more at risk for developing more significant mental illnesses as they get older, such as antisocial personality disorder. Attention deficit disorder is also a risk factor because of the impulsivity, the risk-taking behaviors. But again, a lot of people have ADHD. About 7% of children have that disorder. In and of itself, it's not a significant risk factor, but it is a risk factor when coupled with some of the other developmental risk factors.